What would you do if you came home to find your pregnant wife convulsing from poison, foam at her lips, knowing that someone had deliberately tried to murder both her and your unborn child? What if you knew the killers would return at midnight to finish what they started? Tonight's story takes us to the fertile valleys of Colorado Territory, 1884, where vast cattle ranches stretched as far as the eye could see, and a man's worth was measured by the acres he could defend. Here in a land where water rights meant the difference between fortune and ruin, a young couple was about to discover that some men would kill for what others had built with their own hands. This is the tale of Mason Keller, a 32-year-old rancher who'd carved the most prosperous spread in 3 counties from raw wilderness, and his beloved wife Molly, 6 months heavy with their first child and glowing with the promise of new life. Their 1,500-acre ranch sat on the sweetest water source in the territory, a natural spring that never ran dry, even in the harshest drought years. But prosperity breeds envy, and success attracts predators. Cornelius Vandermeer, the territory's most ruthless land baron, had been circling the Keller ranch like a vulture for months. He'd made offers, generous ones at first, then threatening ones when Mason refused to sell. What Vandermeer wanted wasn't just the land, but the water rights that came with it. Control the water, control the territory. It was an old game, but one played with deadly stakes. In 1884, a pregnant woman in her 6th month faced dangers that modern medicine has long forgotten. Without hospitals or trained doctors within a day's ride, expectant mothers relied on midwives, home remedies, and prayers to see them through childbirth. Every ache was watched, every symptom noted with careful attention. Molly Keller had been blessed with an easy pregnancy so far. No morning sickness after the 3rd month, strong kicks from the baby, and the robust health that came from clean mountain air and honest work. She should have been safe in her own home, tending to the evening chores, while Mason made his weekly trip to town for supplies. The ranch house Mason had built for his bride was solid and well defended. Thick log walls, good sight lines, and enough provisions to weather a siege if necessary. It sat in a natural meadow surrounded by rolling hills, with a life-giving spring bubbling up just 50 yards from the front door. But even the strongest fortress means nothing when the enemy strikes from within, when trust becomes a weapon, and when the very water that gives life can be turned into an instrument of death. Mason had left that morning with his closest friend, Tobias Murphy, planning to be back before supper. It was a routine they'd followed for months, never leaving Molly alone for more than a few hours, especially now that she was showing her condition. At 6 months, her belly had rounded beautifully, and she'd taken to talking to the baby as she went about her daily tasks, her hands resting protectively over the life growing within her. The plan was simple, brutal, and designed to look like natural causes. A slow-acting poison slipped into the well water would sicken Molly gradually, mimicking the complications that sometimes claimed expectant mothers in their final months. By the time anyone realized what had happened, she'd be dead, the baby lost, and Mason would be a grieving widower ready to sell his cursed land and start fresh somewhere else. It was the perfect crime, except for one crucial miscalculation. Mason Keller was not the kind of man to accept tragedy without investigation. He'd fought Apaches, survived blizzards that killed lesser men, and built his ranch from nothing through sheer determination and careful observation. When he found his wife dying, he wouldn't just grieve, he'd hunt. What Cornelius Vandermeer didn't understand was that some men become more dangerous when they have everything to lose. Mason had found the woman who completed his soul, built a home worthy of her love, and was about to become a father. These weren't just possessions to be surrendered. They were sacred trusts to be defended with his life. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains on that fateful evening, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Mason Keller was riding home with supplies and his best friend's laughter, completely unaware that his world was about to explode into violence and desperation. The poison was already doing its work. The killers were already planning their midnight return, and Mason Keller was about to discover just how far a man will go to protect the family he loves. Get ready for a story of love, betrayal, and the kind of justice that can only be found at the business end of a Winchester rifle. The wagon wheels crunched over the familiar gravel path as Mason Keller guided his team toward the ranch house, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the Colorado meadow. Beside him on the wooden seat, Tobias Murphy stretched his arms and groaned with the satisfaction of a successful trip to town. 4 bags of flour, 2 of sugar, and enough coffee beans to keep you awake until Christmas, Toby said, patting the supplies loaded in the wagon bed. Molly's going to be pleased with that bolt of blue calico. Matches her eyes, just like you said. Mason smiled, his weathered hands steady on the reins. At 32, he learned to appreciate the simple pleasures: a successful business trip, a friend's easy companionship, and the prospect of seeing his wife's face light up over a length of pretty fabric. The blue calico had cost more than he'd usually spend on such luxuries, but Molly was 6 months along now, her dresses growing tight across her expanding belly, and she deserved something beautiful to wear as she carried their child. She's been working too hard, Mason said, guiding the horses around a fallen branch. Yesterday I found her trying to move the heavy kitchen table by herself, said she wanted to scrub underneath it proper, told her the baby doesn't care if there's dust under the furniture. But you know how she gets. Toby chuckled. My sister was the same way when she was expecting. Nesting, Ma called it. Had her scrubbing everything twice and rearranging the furniture every other day. Said the baby needed everything perfect for its arrival. The Keller ranch house came into view, a solid structure of hewn logs and river stone that Mason had built with his own hands during the first 2 years of their marriage. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney by now. Molly always had supper started by this time of day, the kitchen filled with the warm aromas of baking bread and whatever game Mason had brought in during the week. But no smoke curled skyward, and the windows showed no welcoming glow of lamplight. That's odd, Mason murmured, pulling the horses to a stop near the front porch. The silence felt wrong somehow, too complete. Even their dog, Rex, wasn't barking his usual greeting. Molly always has the lamps lit by now. Toby frowned, his jovial mood evaporating as he scanned the quiet homestead. Maybe she's resting. Pregnant women need their sleep, especially in the later months. But Mason was already climbing down from the wagon, his boots hitting the ground with more urgency than usual. Something cold and sharp twisted in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive during his scouting days with the cavalry. The house felt too still, like the moment before an Apache attack, when even the birds stopped singing. Molly, he called out, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. Molly, we're back. No answer. Mason pushed through the front door, Toby close behind him. The interior of the house was dim and eerily quiet. The kitchen table still held the remnants of what looked like an interrupted meal. A half-eaten bowl of soup, a piece of bread with 1 bite taken from it, a glass of water knocked over and spilled across the wooden surface. Molly! Mason's voice echoed through the rooms, higher and more desperate now. He moved quickly through the house, checking the parlor, the kitchen, their bedroom. That's where he found her. Molly lay on their bed, curled on her side with her knees drawn up toward her swollen belly. Her face was pale as winter snow, her lips tinged with an unnatural blue color. Foam flecked the corners of her mouth, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Her hands clutched at her midsection, whether from pain or some instinctive need to protect their unborn child. Mason couldn't tell. Dear God, Toby breathed from the doorway. What happened to her? Mason was already at her side, his hands hovering over her body, afraid to touch her, afraid not to. Molly? Molly, can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with pain. When she saw him, she tried to speak, but only a weak moan escaped her lips. She reached for him with trembling fingers, and he grasped her hand, shocked by how cold and clammy her skin felt. The baby, she whispered, the words barely audible. Mason, the baby. Terror unlike anything he'd ever experienced gripped Mason's heart. He'd faced down charging buffalo, fought hand-to-hand with desperate outlaws, stared death in the face more times than he could count. But nothing had prepared him for this. Seeing the woman he loved, the mother of his unborn child, slipping away from him and not knowing why. What happened, sweetheart? Did you fall? Are you hurt? He smoothed her sweat-dampened hair back from her forehead, his voice gentle despite the panic clawing at his chest. Molly's eyes rolled back, her body convulsing slightly. More foam appeared at her lips, and Mason had seen enough poisoned cattle to recognize the signs. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. "Toby," he said, his voice deadly calm, "ride to town. Get Doc Morrison. Tell him." Mason's throat closed momentarily as he looked at his wife's deteriorating condition. "Tell him it's poison. Tell him to bring everything he's got." Toby didn't waste time with questions. "I'll have him here within 2 hours," he promised, already turning toward the door. "Don't let her drink anything, Mason. And if she gets worse, try to make her vomit. Get whatever's in her stomach out." The sound of Toby's boots pounding across the porch and his urgent shouts to his horse faded quickly. Mason was alone with his dying wife, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt completely helpless. He checked Molly's pulse, rapid and thready. Her skin was growing colder by the minute, and the slight blue tinge around her lips was becoming more pronounced. At 6 months pregnant, she should have been glowing with health, her body strong and resilient. Instead, she looked fragile as a bird with a broken wing. "Stay with me, Molly," he whispered, gathering her into his arms as carefully as he could manage. "You stay with me, you hear? You and the baby both. We're going to get through this." But even as he spoke the words, Mason's mind was racing through the terrible possibilities. Poison didn't just happen by accident, not out here in the middle of nowhere. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had tried to murder his wife and unborn child. The who and why would have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was keeping Molly alive until the doctor arrived. Mason had learned basic field medicine during his cavalry days, enough to treat bullet wounds and snake bites. But poison was different. Poison attacked from the inside, corrupting the very blood that carried life through the body. He carried her to the kitchen, supporting her weight as she swayed weakly against him. If Toby was right about making her vomit, he needed to try. Mason mixed salt into a glass of fresh water from their well, praying it wasn't contaminated too. "I need you to drink this, sweetheart," he said, holding the glass to her lips. "I know you don't want to, but it might help." Molly managed a few sips before her stomach rebelled. She turned away from him and retched violently, her whole body shaking with the effort. Mason held her hair back, his heart breaking as she brought up what little food she'd managed to eat that day. When the spasms passed, she collapsed against him, utterly spent. But her breathing seemed slightly easier, and some of the blue color had faded from her lips. Maybe, just maybe, they'd gotten some of the poison out in time. "That's it," Mason murmured, carrying her back to their bed. "That's my girl. You fight this thing, Molly. You fight it with everything you've got." As he settled her under the quilts his mother had made for their wedding, Mason's eyes fell on the overturned water glass in the kitchen. The water had come from their well, the same well that fed their entire ranch, the same water source that made their land so valuable. Someone had poisoned their water. Someone who knew their routines, knew that Molly would be alone this afternoon, knew exactly when to strike for maximum effect. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence. This was calculated, methodical murder, and Mason Keller was going to find out who was responsible, even if it meant tearing the territory apart stone by stone. But first he had to save his wife and child. Everything else could wait until Molly was safe in his arms again, their baby moving strong and healthy beneath her heart. Outside, the Colorado evening was settling into the kind of peaceful quiet that had always brought Mason comfort. Tonight, that silence felt ominous, pregnant with unspoken threats and the promise of violence to come. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through the oppressive silence that had settled over the Keller ranch. Mason looked up from where he sat beside Molly's bed, her cold hand clutched in both of his. For the past hour and a half, he'd watched her slip in and out of consciousness, her breathing growing more labored with each passing minute. The baby had stopped moving entirely, and that terrified him more than anything else. "That'll be Doc Morrison," Mason said softly, though Molly showed no sign of hearing him. Her face had taken on a waxy pallor that reminded him too much of the dead men he'd seen during his cavalry days. The front door burst open without ceremony, followed by the heavy footsteps of men in a hurry. Dr. Samuel Morrison appeared in the bedroom doorway, his medical bag clutched in one weathered hand, and his coat still dusty from the hard ride. Behind him, Toby Murphy's face was grim with exhaustion and worry. "How long has she been like this?" Dr. Morrison asked without preamble, already moving to Molly's side. At 65, he was the only trained physician within a day's ride, a former Army surgeon who'd settled in Colorado Territory after seeing too much death during the war between the states. "I found her about 2 hours ago," Mason replied, reluctantly releasing Molly's hand to give the doctor room to work. "She was convulsing, foam at her mouth. I made her vomit once. Got some of it out of her system." Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly as he began his examination, checking Molly's pulse, lifting her eyelids to peer at her pupils, listening to her heart through a wooden stethoscope. "You did right. Probably saved her life." He opened his medical bag and withdrew a small brown bottle. "This is Ipecac syrup. It'll make her vomit again, but we need to get every trace of poison out of her system." "Will it hurt the baby?" Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor's hesitation was answer enough. "At 6 months, the baby's chances depend entirely on the mother's survival. If we lose Molly, we lose them both. If we can save her, the baby has a fighting chance." Mason felt like he'd been punched in the gut, but he nodded grimly. "Do whatever you have to do." For the next 30 minutes, the bedroom became a battlefield where medical science fought against deliberate murder. Dr. Morrison administered the Ipecac, then held Molly's head as her body violently expelled whatever remained in her stomach. Mason held her legs to keep her from injuring herself during the convulsions, while Toby fetched clean water and towels as directed. "What kind of poison?" Mason asked during a brief lull in the treatment. Dr. Morrison wiped his hands on a clean towel, his expression grave. "Based on the symptoms, the foam, the convulsions, the blue lips, I'd say strychnine. It's relatively easy to obtain if you know where to look. Rat poison mostly, though some folks use it for wolves and coyotes." "How much would it take to—" Mason couldn't finish the question. "To kill a grown woman?" "Not much. A teaspoon mixed into food or drink would be more than enough. But here's the thing about strychnine. It acts fast when taken in large doses, slower in smaller amounts. Whoever did this either didn't know the proper dosage or they wanted her to suffer." Mason's hands clenched into fists. The idea that someone had deliberately chosen to make Molly suffer, to cause her agony while carrying their child, filled him with a rage so pure and cold it was almost calming. "Can you save her?" he asked. Dr. Morrison was preparing another dose of medicine, this one from a different bottle. "The next few hours will tell. We've gotten most of the poison out, but strychnine damages the nervous system. Even if she survives, there could be lasting effects." "What about the baby?" "Too early to know. The baby's movement stopping is concerning, but it could just be the mother's distress affecting the child. We'll know more when Molly's condition stabilizes." As if responding to their conversation, Molly's eyes fluttered open. They were clearer now, more focused, though still clouded with pain and confusion. "Mason," she whispered, her voice hoarse from vomiting. "I'm here, sweetheart." He took her hand again, relief flooding through him at the sound of her voice. "You're going to be fine. Doc Morrison's taking good care of you." "The baby," she said, her free hand moving instinctively to her swollen belly. "Is the baby—" "Still there," Dr. Morrison said gently, placing his stethoscope against her abdomen. After a long moment, his weathered face broke into the first smile Mason had seen since his arrival. "And I can hear a heartbeat, strong and steady." Mason felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. Toby clapped a supportive hand on his shoulder, and even the usually stoic doctor seemed pleased with this development. "How do you feel, Mrs. Keller?" Dr. Morrison asked. Molly considered the question carefully, taking inventory of her body. "Weak, shaky, but the cramping has stopped, and I don't feel like I'm going to be sick anymore." "That's a good sign. The worst of the poison is out of your system." He packed away his stethoscope and reached for another bottle. "I'm going to give you something to help you rest. Sleep is the best medicine now, for both you and the baby." As Dr. Morrison prepared the sleeping draft, Mason helped Molly sit up enough to drink it. She was still pale and weak, but the blue tinge had completely disappeared from her lips, and her breathing was steady and normal. "Mason," she said quietly, catching his arm before he could move away. This wasn't an accident, was it? He met her eyes, seeing the intelligence there, despite her weakened state. Molly had always been sharp, quick to see through pretense and lies. There was no point in trying to protect her from the truth. "No," he said simply. "Someone poisoned our well water." "Vandermeer," she said without hesitation. Dr. Morrison looked up sharply. "Cornelius Vandermeer? What's he got to do with this?" Mason quickly explained about the land baron's increasingly aggressive offers to buy their ranch, the threats that had followed Mason's continued refusals, and the importance of their water rights to Vandermeer's plans for territorial dominance. "He's been after our land for months," Mason concluded, "made it clear that one way or another he intended to have it." Dr. Morrison's expression darkened. "I've known Cornelius Vandermeer for 15 years. He's ruthless, greedy, and completely without conscience when it comes to getting what he wants. But poisoning a pregnant woman?" He shook his head. "That's a new low even for him." "Can you prove it was him?" Toby asked. "Not yet," Mason replied. "But I will. Someone had to get close enough to our well to put poison in it. Someone who knew our routines, knew when Molly would be alone." "What about Sheriff Cross?" Dr. Morrison suggested. "Nathaniel's a good man. He'd investigate this properly." Mason's laugh was bitter. "Sheriff Cross has been taking Vandermeer's money for the past year. Half the town knows it, even if nobody talks about it openly. He's not going to investigate his benefactor for attempted murder." Dr. Morrison finished administering the sleeping medicine to Molly, who was already beginning to drift off despite her obvious desire to stay awake and continue the conversation. "Rest now, sweetheart," Mason murmured, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "When you wake up, this will all be over." But even as he spoke the comforting words, Mason knew the nightmare was just beginning. Vandermeer had tried to murder his wife and unborn child. The attempt had failed, but men like Cornelius Vandermeer didn't accept failure gracefully. He would try again, and next time, he might not rely on something as uncertain as poison. Dr. Morrison packed up his medical bag, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'll stay tonight," he said. "Watch over her, make sure there are no complications. But Mason, you need to understand. Whoever did this will know by now that their plan failed. Molly's still alive, still a threat to whatever they're planning." "What are you saying?" Mason asked, though he already knew. "I'm saying they'll be back, and next time they won't be satisfied with making it look like an accident." Outside, the Colorado night was settling over the ranch with deceptive peace. Somewhere in that darkness, Mason knew, Cornelius Vandermeer was learning that Molly Keller had survived his attempt on her life. And somewhere else, desperate men were making new plans to finish what they'd started. Mason checked his rifle and revolver, ensuring both were loaded and ready. Whatever came next, he would be prepared. Molly and their unborn child were depending on him, and he would not fail them again. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Colorado mountains, the autumn air carrying the promise of winter in its bite. Mason had spent the night in a chair beside Molly's bed, his rifle across his knees, watching the windows and listening for any sound that didn't belong. Dr. Morrison dozed fitfully in the parlor, waking every hour to check on his patient. Toby had taken the first watch outside, circling the ranch house with the silent vigilance of a man who'd learned caution the hard way. Molly stirred as the pale light crept through the bedroom windows, her eyes clearer than they'd been since Mason found her poison. The baby had begun moving again during the night, gentle flutters that brought tears of relief to both parents' eyes. "How do you feel?" Mason asked softly, reaching over to touch her forehead. "No fever, thank God." "Better," she said, struggling to sit up. Mason helped her, adjusting the pillows behind her back. "Weak but better. The baby's been active all morning." Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, his medical bag in hand. "That's exactly what we want to hear. Active baby means healthy baby." He moved to Molly's side, checking her pulse and listening to her heart. "Your color's good. Breathing's normal. I think you're going to make a full recovery, Mrs. Keller." "And the baby?" "Strong heartbeat, good movement. The little one seems to have weathered the storm just fine." Dr. Morrison packed away his stethoscope. "But I want you on bed rest for the next week. No getting up except for necessary business. That poison put tremendous stress on your system. Mason was about to respond when Toby's voice called urgently from outside. Mason! Company coming! All three of them froze. Mason moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see out. A group of riders was approaching from the east, moving at a deliberate pace that suggested confidence rather than haste. At their head rode a man Mason recognized immediately, tall, well-dressed, sitting his horse with the arrogance of someone who'd never been told no and meant to keep it that way. Cornelius Vandermeer, Mason said grimly. Dr. Morrison moved to look over Mason's shoulder. He's got 8 men with him, all armed. He's not here for a social call, Mason observed, noting the rifles and revolvers visible on every rider. Doc, I need you to stay with Molly. Keep her down and away from the windows. Mason, no, Molly protested, trying to get out of bed. Don't go out there alone. I'm not alone. Toby's out there, and I'm not about to let Vandermeer intimidate us in our own home. Mason checked his Colt revolver, then picked up his Winchester. Besides, he wants this land too much to risk killing me in broad daylight. He still thinks he can get what he wants through threats and pressure. Mason stepped out onto the front porch, his rifle held casually but ready. Toby emerged from behind the barn, his own weapon visible but not directly threatening. The message was clear. They were prepared but not looking for immediate trouble. Cornelius Vandermeer was exactly what Mason had expected from a man of his reputation. Somewhere in his 50s with silver hair and a carefully groomed beard that spoke of expensive barbers and unlimited leisure time. His clothes were tailored, his boots polished, his horse the kind of thoroughbred that cost more than most men made in a year. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, but it was his eyes that told the real story. Pale blue, cold as winter ice, and completely devoid of human warmth. These were the eyes of a man who saw other people as obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. Mr. Keller, Vandermeer said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. I heard your wife took ill yesterday. I do hope she's recovering well. She's fine, Mason replied, his voice level and controlled, though I'm sure you already know that. Vandermeer's smile never wavered, but something flickered in those cold eyes. I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning. I've been at my ranch all day, attending to business matters. I'm sure you have been. Mason stepped to the edge of the porch, close enough to study Vandermeer's face. It's amazing how a man can be in 2 places at once, sitting in his parlor while his hired poison finds its way into other folks' well water. The accusation hung in the air between them like a drawn blade. Vandermeer's men shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. But Vandermeer himself remained perfectly calm, even amused. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Keller. I hope you have proof to back up such claims. I have a wife who nearly died from strychnine poisoning. I have a well that was pure yesterday morning and contaminated by evening. And I have a neighbor who's been making increasingly violent threats about acquiring my land. Mason's grip tightened on his rifle. Seems like proof enough for most reasonable people. Unfortunately, Sheriff Cross requires more than suspicion and coincidence to make arrests, Vandermeer replied smoothly. And speaking of the good sheriff, he's asked me to extend an invitation for you and your wife to visit his office at your earliest convenience. There are some questions about the, shall we say, unusual circumstances surrounding yesterday's incident. Mason felt ice form in his stomach. Sheriff Nathaniel Cross was completely in Vandermeer's pocket. Everyone in the territory knew it, even if nobody spoke about it openly. If Vandermeer was involving the sheriff, it meant he was moving from covert attempts at murder to using his corrupted authority to frame Mason for some fabricated crime. What kind of questions? Mason asked. Oh, the usual sort. Questions about your wife's emotional state during her pregnancy. Questions about any marital difficulties you might be experiencing. Questions about life insurance policies and outstanding debts. Vandermeer's smile turned predatory. You'd be surprised how often domestic disputes result in tragic accidents involving household poisons. The implication was crystal clear. Vandermeer intended to frame Mason for attempting to murder his own wife, probably as part of some elaborate scheme to claim insurance money or escape mounting debts. With Sheriff Cross's cooperation, it would be Mason's word against a respected businessman's, and everyone knew how that would end. You son of a bitch, Mason said quietly. Now, Mr. Keller. There's no need for harsh language. Vandermeer straightened in his saddle, his voice taking on the tone of a man delivering a final ultimatum. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sell me this ranch, all 1,500 acres, including the water rights, for a fair and reasonable price. In return, I'll make sure Sheriff Cross understands that yesterday's incident was simply an unfortunate accident caused by contaminated well water. No charges filed, no questions asked. And if I refuse, then I'm afraid the sheriff will have no choice but to investigate the attempted murder of Mrs. Molly Keller by her own husband. He's already found some very interesting evidence. Unpaid gambling debts, mysterious visits to the pharmacy for rat poison, overheard arguments between you and your wife about money. Vandermeer's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. It's amazing how witnesses can remember things differently when properly motivated. Mason felt the walls closing in around him. Vandermeer had been planning this for months, laying groundwork, bribing officials, creating false evidence. Even if Mason could prove his innocence, the legal battle would take years and cost everything he owned. Worse, Molly would be left alone and vulnerable while he sat in jail awaiting trial. How much? Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. $20,000 cash. I'll have the papers drawn up this afternoon, and we can complete the transaction tomorrow. $20,000 was a fraction of what the ranch was actually worth, especially with its water rights and prime grazing land. But it was enough for Mason and Molly to start over somewhere else. Maybe California or Oregon, far from Vandermeer's influence. I need time to think, Mason said. Of course. You have until sunset tomorrow to make your decision. Vandermeer gathered his reins, preparing to leave. But Mason, may I call you Mason? I want you to understand something very clearly. This is the only offer you're going to get. If you refuse, or if you try to involve federal authorities or outside law enforcement, then Mrs. Keller's unfortunate accident yesterday will suddenly become much more tragic. Strychnine is unpredictable, you know. Sometimes victims appear to recover, only to suffer fatal relapses days later. The threat was unmistakable. If Mason didn't sell, Vandermeer would find a way to finish what he'd started with Molly. Sunset tomorrow, Vandermeer repeated. Don't keep me waiting. The group of riders turned and departed as deliberately as they'd arrived, leaving Mason standing on his porch with rage and helplessness warring in his chest. He had less than 36 hours to decide between surrendering everything he'd built or watching his wife and unborn child die. Behind him, he could hear Dr. Morrison comforting Molly, whose sobs carried clearly through the bedroom window. She'd heard everything, understood exactly what kind of choice they were facing. As Mason watched Vandermeer's riders disappear over the ridge, he made a different kind of decision entirely. Some things were worth more than money, more than safety, more than life itself. Cornelius Vandermeer was about to learn that Mason Keller was not the kind of man who surrendered what he loved without a fight. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Keller ranch as Mason stood in his barn, methodically cleaning his rifles and checking his ammunition supplies. Dr. Morrison had departed an hour earlier, satisfied that Molly was out of immediate danger, but worried about what Mason might be planning. The old Army surgeon had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who decided that death was preferable to surrender. You can't fight them all, Mason, Toby said from where he sat on a hay bale, loading cartridges into his revolver. Vandermeer's got money, men, and the law on his side. Even if we win the shooting, we'll lose everything else. Mason worked the bolt on his Winchester, the smooth action providing a familiar comfort. Maybe, but I'm not handing over my wife and child to that butcher without making him pay for it. There's got to be another way. What about the federal marshals? Surely they'd investigate if they knew what was happening here. By the time federal help arrives, Molly and the baby will be dead, and I'll be swinging from Sheriff Cross's gallows. Mason set the rifle aside and picked up his shotgun, checking the double barrels. No, Toby, this ends tomorrow, one way or another. Through the barn door, Mason could see the ranch house where Molly was supposed to be resting. Instead, she was sitting by the bedroom window, her sewing in her lap, watching for signs of approaching danger. At 6 months pregnant, she should have been planning nursery decorations and choosing baby names. Instead, she was keeping watch while her husband prepared for a war that might leave their child orphaned. The sound of approaching horses made both men freeze. Mason grabbed his rifle and moved to the barn door, but relaxed when he recognized the riders. Ben Harper and his two sons were approaching from the south, their faces grim with purpose. "Mason!" Ben called out as he dismounted. "Heard what happened to Molly. Came as soon as we could." Ben Harper owned the spread adjacent to Mason's southern border, 300 acres of decent grazing land that Vandermeer had also been pressuring him to sell. Ben was in his 50s, a widower who'd been raising his sons alone since his wife died in childbirth 8 years earlier. His boys, Tom and Jake, were in their early 20s, tough as rawhide and loyal as bloodhounds. "Ben, you shouldn't be here," Mason said, though he was grateful to see friendly faces. "This is my fight." "Like hell it is," Ben replied, his weathered face hard as granite. "Vandermeer's been after my land too, making threats, trying to buy off my mortgage at the bank. What he did to Molly, that's the act of a mad dog, and mad dogs need to be put down." Tom Harper, the elder son, stepped forward. "We brought extra ammunition and food supplies. Figure if we're going to make a stand, we might as well do it right." Jake, barely 21 but already showing the steady nerves of a seasoned fighter, was unloading rifles from their pack horses. Plus, word's getting around town about what really happened here. The McBride family sends their regards. They'll be here before dark. Mason felt a surge of hope mixed with concern. The McBrides owned a small farm to the east, just 20 acres. But they were good people who'd been fighting Vandermeer's intimidation tactics for months. However, involving more families meant putting more innocent lives at risk. "I appreciate the support, but you all have families to think about," Mason said. "If we lose this fight, Vandermeer won't stop with just me. He'll come after everyone who stood against him." "Then we better not lose," Ben Harper said simply. As if summoned by their conversation, more riders appeared on the horizon. This time it was Sean O'Malley and his 3 brothers, Irish immigrants who'd staked a claim in the valley 2 years earlier. Behind them came the Reverend Phillips and his son David, both carrying hunting rifles despite the preacher's usual advocacy for peaceful solutions. "Word travels fast," Toby observed. "Faster than Vandermeer expected, I'd guess," Mason replied. "He probably figured I'd face this alone, maybe with just you for company." By sunset, Mason's ranch had been transformed into an armed camp. 15 men had answered the call, ranging from experienced fighters like Ben Harper to young hotheads like the O'Malley brothers, who were spoiling for a fight with anyone who represented the kind of English-speaking authority that had driven them from Ireland. Mason stood on his front porch looking out at the men who'd risked everything to stand with him. Some were cleaning weapons, others were digging defensive positions around the house and barn. All of them had left their own families and properties to help him protect his. "It's not too late to reconsider," he called out. "Vandermeer's ultimatum was for me, not for all of you. You can still ride out of here, go back to your homes, and no one will think less of you for it." "Shut up, Mason," Ben Harper said without looking up from the rifle he was cleaning. "You're starting to sound like a politician." Laughter rippled through the group, easing some of the tension that had been building all afternoon. These were frontier men, accustomed to solving their problems with direct action rather than lengthy debate. They'd made their choice, and now they were committed to seeing it through. Mason went inside to check on Molly, who was still maintaining her vigil by the window, despite Dr. Morrison's orders for bed rest. Her face was pale but determined, and she kept one hand protectively over her swollen belly. "How many?" she asked as Mason sat on the bed beside her. 15 good men, all armed and ready." He took her free hand in both of his. "Molly, I need you to understand. If things go bad tomorrow, if it looks like we're going to lose, I want you to take the horse and ride for the territorial capital. Don't stop, don't look back, just get as far from here as possible." "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "You're carrying our child. That baby is more important than this ranch, more important than my pride, more important than anything else in the world." Mason's voice cracked slightly. "Promise me, Molly. Promise me you'll save our child if I can't." Tears began streaming down her face, but she nodded. "I promise. But Mason, you better do everything in your power to make sure it doesn't come to that." "I will," he said, pulling her close. "I swear to you, I will." Outside, night was falling over the Colorado Territory, with the kind of crystal clarity that only came at high altitude. The stars were beginning to emerge, bright and cold against the darkening sky. Mason could hear his men settling in for what might be their last night on Earth, some telling stories, others writing letters to wives and children they might never see again. Toby appeared in the bedroom doorway. "Mason, you need to see this." Mason followed his friend outside where Ben Harper was standing watch on the barn roof with a spyglass. The older man climbed down and handed Mason the telescope. "Take a look at that ridge to the north," Ben said grimly. Mason focused the glass on the distant ridgeline and felt his blood turn cold. Campfires dotted the hillside, at least a dozen of them, maybe more. Each fire probably represented 3 or 4 men, which meant Vandermeer had assembled a small army for tomorrow's confrontation. 40, maybe 50 men, Mason estimated, lowering the spyglass. "Professional gunfighters, most likely," Ben added. "Vandermeer's got the money to hire the best killers in the territory." Mason did the mathematics in his head. 15 defenders against 50 attackers, with the attackers choosing the time and method of assault. The odds were not encouraging. "We could still negotiate," Toby suggested quietly. "Send someone to talk terms with Vandermeer. Maybe work out some kind of compromise." "The time for negotiation ended when he poisoned my wife," Mason replied. "Besides, you heard his ultimatum. He's not interested in compromise. He wants total surrender or total destruction." Tom Harper joined their group, his young face serious in the starlight. "My pa's right about one thing. Those are professional killers up there. They'll come at us hard and fast, probably just before dawn when we're most likely to be tired and careless." "Then we'll be ready for them," Mason said with more confidence than he felt. "We've got good defensive positions, plenty of ammunition, and 15 men who know this land better than any hired guns Vandermeer could bring in." "And we've got something they don't," Jake Harper added, his voice carrying the fierce pride of youth. "What's that?" Mason asked. "We've got something worth dying for." As the night deepened around them, Mason knew the youngest Harper boy was right. Tomorrow would bring violence and probably death, but it would also bring resolution. One way or another, the question of who controlled this valley would be settled before another sunset. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the campfires, Cornelius Vandermeer was making his final preparations for war. And in the ranch house behind them, Molly Keller was praying for the safety of her husband and the future of their unborn child. The waiting was almost over. The attack came with the first gray light of dawn, just as Tom Harper had predicted. Mason was already awake, having spent the night moving between defensive positions and checking on his men. The cold mountain air carried the sound of approaching horses, not the thunderous charge he'd expected, but the careful advance of professional killers who knew their business. "Here they come," Ben Harper whispered from his position behind the water trough. 43 men, spread out in a wide line. They're trying to surround us." Mason crouched behind the porch railing, his Winchester loaded and ready. Through the pre-dawn gloom, he could see Vandermeer's hired guns dismounting and taking cover behind trees, rocks, and his own outbuildings. These weren't the desperate outlaws or drunken cowboys he'd expected. These men moved with military precision, their weapons held with the easy familiarity of experienced killers. "Wait for my signal," Mason called softly to his defenders. "Let them get close, then make every shot count." Inside the house, Molly was supposed to be hiding in the root cellar, as Mason had insisted. Instead, she stood at the bedroom window with her father's old rifle, her 6-month belly making it difficult to find a comfortable shooting position. She'd learned to shoot as a girl, and despite Mason's protests, she'd refused to cower in the dark while her husband and friends fought for their lives. The first shot came from somewhere near the barn, one of Vandermeer's men trying to pick off Jake Harper, who was positioned in the hayloft. The bullet splintered wood inches from the young man's head, and Jake's return shot dropped the gunfighter where he stood. That single exchange opened the floodgates of violence. Gunfire erupted from all directions as Vandermeer's small army launched their coordinated assault. The defenders of the Keller Ranch found themselves fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, their only advantages being intimate knowledge of the terrain and the desperate courage of men protecting their homes and families. Mason's Winchester cracked steadily as he picked his targets with the cold precision he'd learned during his cavalry days. Each shot was carefully aimed, each bullet conserved for maximum effect. To his left, Toby Murphy was working his lever action rifle like a machine, laying down covering fire for the O'Malley brothers as they repositioned behind the well. "Mason!" Ben Harper's voice carried over the gunfire. "They're trying to flank us on the south side." Mason could see the movement Harper was talking about. A group of gunfighters working their way through the scrub brush, trying to get behind the ranch house where they could fire through the windows. If they succeeded, Molly would be trapped with nowhere to run. "Tom, Jake, cover the south approach," Mason shouted. "Don't let them get behind us." The Harper boys opened fire on the flanking maneuver, their shots forcing the attackers to take cover. But more gunmen were moving up from the north, and Mason realized with growing desperation that they were being systematically surrounded. A bullet whined past his ear, followed by another that punched through the porch railing beside his head. Mason rolled to a new position, coming up behind a thick support post as splinters exploded around him. Through the acrid gun smoke, he could see Cornelius Vandermeer himself, mounted on his thoroughbred horse about 200 yards away, directing the battle like a general commanding his troops. "There," Mason pointed toward Vandermeer. "The man on horseback. He's calling the shots." Sean O'Malley raised his rifle, took careful aim, and fired. The bullet missed Vandermeer, but killed his horse, sending the land baron tumbling to the ground. Even at this distance, Mason could see the rage on Vandermeer's face as he scrambled for cover behind his dead mount. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The defenders were holding their own, but they were taking casualties. One of the O'Malley brothers was down with a bullet in his shoulder, and Reverend Phillips had been grazed across the forehead, blood streaming down his face as he continued to fire with grim determination. Then disaster struck from an unexpected direction. "Fire!" Tom Harper screamed from the barn. "The barn's on fire!" Mason spun around to see flames licking at the dry timber of his barn. Some of Vandermeer's men had worked close enough to throw burning torches, and the autumn-cured hay inside was going up like a tinderbox. Jake Harper was trapped in the hayloft, surrounded by spreading flames with gunmen covering every exit. "Jake!" Ben Harper started to rise from his position, but Mason grabbed his arm. "Stay down! I'll get him!" Mason sprinted across the open ground between the house and the barn, bullets kicking up dust around his feet. He could hear Molly screaming his name from the house, could feel the heat of the flames on his face as he reached the barn door. Inside, the smoke was already thick enough to choke on. Mason could hear Jake Harper coughing in the loft above, could see the young man silhouetted against the flames as he tried to find a way down. "Jake, jump! Can't! They've got the ladder covered!" Mason looked around desperately and spotted a coil of rope hanging from a support beam. He grabbed it, secured one end to a post, and threw the other end up to Jake. "Slide down! Now!" Jake wrapped the rope around his waist and rappelled down just as a section of the loft floor collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. Both men stumbled out of the barn as the roof began to cave in, their clothes smoking, their lungs seared by the superheated air. But their escape had cost precious time and attention. While Mason was rescuing Jake, Vandermeer's men had pressed their advantage. The defenders were now pinned down in a steadily shrinking perimeter around the ranch house, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. "We can't hold them much longer," Toby shouted over the gunfire. "They're closing in." Mason could see it too. The professional gunfighters were advancing methodically, using covering fire and tactical movement to tighten their grip on the ranch house. Soon they'd be close enough to rush the defenders' positions, and when that happened, the superior numbers would tell. That's when Molly made her decision. The bedroom window exploded outward as she smashed it with her rifle butt. Before Mason could stop her, she was leaning out the window, her father's old Sharps rifle aimed at the attackers, closest to the house. "Get away from my home," she screamed, and fired. The heavy .50 caliber bullet took down one of Vandermeer's men with devastating effect. Molly worked the single-shot rifle's action, reloaded, and fired again, and again. Her unexpected intervention from an unguarded direction threw the attackers into confusion. Several men who'd been advancing on the house suddenly found themselves under accurate fire from a completely different angle. They scattered for cover, disrupting their coordinated assault. "Molly, get back!" Mason shouted, but she ignored him. She was magnificent and terrifying. A pregnant woman defending her unborn child with the ferocity of a lioness protecting her cubs. Each shot was carefully aimed, each bullet accounting for one less enemy threatening her family. But the exposure was deadly. Return fire began focusing on the bedroom window, bullets shattering what remained of the glass and chewing chunks out of the window frame. Mason watched in horror as a bullet tugged at Molly's hair, missing her head by inches. "Cover her!" he roared, and every defender still able to fight opened up with everything they had. The concentrated return fire forced Vandermeer's men back, but Mason could see that the respite was only temporary. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly out of ammunition. In another few minutes, the attackers would regroup and finish what they'd started. That's when salvation arrived from an unexpected direction. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats came from the east, and Mason's heart sank, thinking it was Vandermeer's reinforcements. Instead, a new voice cut through the gunfire, one that carried the authority of legitimate law enforcement. "This is Sheriff Nathaniel Cross. Cease firing immediately." Mason couldn't believe what he was seeing. Sheriff Cross was riding hard toward the battle, followed by 6 deputized men, all wearing badges and carrying rifles. The corrupt lawman who'd been taking Vandermeer's money was arriving like the cavalry in a dime novel. But whose side was he on? The answer came quickly as Cross and his men opened fire. Not on the defenders, but on Vandermeer's hired killers. "By order of the territorial government," Cross shouted, "you're all under arrest for attempted murder, arson, and unlawful assembly." The tide of battle turned in an instant. Caught between the defending ranchers and the arriving lawmen, Vandermeer's professional gunfighters found themselves outnumbered and outflanked. Some tried to fight, some tried to run, but most simply threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Cornelius Vandermeer himself stood up from behind his dead horse, his expensive clothes torn and dirt-stained, his face a mask of impotent rage. "You can't do this, Cross," he screamed. "I own you. I own this whole territory." Sheriff Cross dismounted and walked calmly toward the land baron, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "Not anymore, Cornelius," he said quietly. "Not anymore." The smoke from the burning barn drifted across the Colorado morning sky like a victory banner as Sheriff Nathaniel Cross placed iron shackles around Cornelius Vandermeer's wrists. The land baron's expensive suit was torn and stained with dirt, his carefully groomed appearance destroyed by his fall from the dead horse and subsequent scramble for cover during the gunfight. "This is preposterous," Vandermeer snarled, his pale blue eyes blazing with impotent fury. "You can't arrest me, Cross. I have documentation of every payment I've made to you, every favor you've done for me. If I go down, you go down with me." Sheriff Cross finished securing the shackles and stepped back, his weathered face calm and resolute. "That's exactly what I'm counting on, Cornelius. Every crime you've committed, every life you've destroyed, every dollar you've stolen, it's all going to come out in court, including my part in it." Mason approached the group of prisoners, his rifle still in his hands, his eyes scanning the captured gunfighters with the cold assessment of a man who'd nearly lost everything. Most of Vandermeer's hired killers sat in the dirt with their hands bound, their weapons confiscated by Cross's deputies. 3 were dead, 5 were wounded, and the rest had surrendered when they realized they were caught between 2 forces of lawmen. "What changed your mind, Sheriff?" Mason asked quietly. Cross removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "Yesterday morning, I woke up and looked at myself in the mirror. Saw a man I didn't recognize. A coward who'd sold his badge and his soul for Vandermeer's gold. Then I heard what he'd done to your wife, how he tried to murder a pregnant woman and her unborn child." The sheriff's voice grew harder, more resolved. "A man can rationalize a lot of things. Taking bribes, looking the other way when land deals get rough, even ignoring some violence between grown men who choose to fight. But poisoning an expectant mother? That's not corruption, Mason. That's pure evil." Toby Murphy limped over, supporting one of the wounded O'Malley brothers. "What happens now? Vandermeer's got lawyers, politicians, judges on his payroll throughout the territory. How do we make sure justice actually gets served?" Cross gestured toward the prisoners. "These hired guns will testify to save their own necks. They'll tell us who paid them. what they were ordered to do, where the money came from. And I've got 15 years worth of evidence locked in my office safe. Every bribe, every threat, every illegal deal Vandermeer's made since he arrived in this territory. Why didn't you come forward before? Ben Harper asked, his suspicion evident in his voice. Because I was a coward, Cross admitted without flinching, and because I thought I could control it, thought I could take his money and still do right by the decent folks in this territory. But evil like Vandermeer's doesn't stay controlled. It grows, spreads, corrupts everything it touches. Mason looked toward the ranch house, where Dr. Morrison was examining Molly on the front porch. The doctor had arrived during the final moments of the gunfight, drawn by the sound of battle, and was now checking both mother and baby for any effects of the morning's violence. "She's fine, doctor," Morrison called out, as if reading Mason's thoughts. "Both she and the baby came through without harm, though I strongly recommend she avoid any more rifle work until after the birth." Molly was sitting in her rocking chair, still holding her father's Sharps rifle across her lap like a talisman. Her face was flushed with the aftermath of battle, but her eyes were bright and determined. At 6 months pregnant, she looked like an ancient goddess of war and fertility, combined into one fierce protective spirit. "How many men did she drop?" Jake Harper asked with obvious admiration. "4, Mason replied with pride. 4 professional killers, and her firing from an upstairs window while carrying our child." "That's some woman you married," Ben Harper observed. "Don't I know it," Mason said, his voice thick with emotion. As the prisoners were loaded into wagons for transport to the territorial jail, Cornelius Vandermeer made one last attempt to assert his authority. "You think this is over?" he called out to Mason. "I have associates, partners, men who depend on my operations. They won't let you destroy everything I built." Sheriff Cross climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. "Your associates are already talking, Cornelius. Seems they value their own freedom more than their loyalty to you. By tonight, we'll have warrants for half the territorial government." As the convoy of wagons disappeared over the ridge, heading toward town and the territorial capital beyond, Mason finally allowed himself to relax. The immediate threat was over. Vandermeer would face justice, his corruption network would be exposed, and the ranchers of the valley would be free to work their land without fear of intimidation or murder. But the cost had been significant. The barn was a total loss, several of his outbuildings were damaged by gunfire, and the expenses of rebuilding would strain their finances. More importantly, the psychological toll of the past few days had left its mark on everyone involved. "Mason," Molly called from the porch, "come sit with me." He climbed the steps and settled into the chair beside her, taking her hand in his. The baby was moving actively now, as if responding to its mother's elevated heart rate during the battle. "Are you all right?" he asked for the 10th time that morning. "I'm perfect," she replied, then grew more serious. "But I need to tell you something. During the fight, when I was shooting at those men, I felt something I've never felt before." "What was that?" Molly placed both hands over her swollen belly, her expression thoughtful. "I felt like I would do anything, absolutely anything, to protect this child, not just from bullets or violence, but from growing up in a world where men like Vandermeer can poison innocent people and face no consequences." Mason squeezed her hand. "That world's gone, sweetheart. Cross and his evidence will see to that. Maybe, but there will always be other Vandermeers, other corrupt men who think money and violence can get them whatever they want." Her green eyes met his with fierce determination. "I want our child to grow up knowing that good people fought back, that when evil tried to take over, decent folks stood up and said no." Over the next several hours, the community that had gathered to defend the Keller Ranch began to disperse. The wounded were tended to and transported to town for proper medical care. The Harper boys helped Mason assess the damage to his property and make plans for rebuilding. The other ranchers and farmers returned to their own spreads, secure in the knowledge that they could work their land without fear. As the sun began to set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mason and Molly found themselves alone on their porch for the first time in days. The silence was profound after the chaos of battle, broken only by the evening breeze through the pine trees and the distant sound of their surviving livestock. "What do we do now?" Molly asked. Mason looked out over his land, 1,500 acres of the finest grazing and farming country in the territory, watered by a spring that never ran dry, blessed with rich soil and abundant game. It was worth fighting for, worth the risks they'd taken and the prices they'd paid. "Now we rebuild," he said. "We put up a new barn, fix the damage, and get ready for our child to be born. We make this place worthy of the family we're creating. And if other men like Vandermeer come around—" Mason's hand moved to the rifle leaning against the porch railing. "Then they'll learn the same lesson Vandermeer learned. Some things are worth more than money or power. Some things are worth everything a man's got to give." As if responding to his words, the baby kicked strongly enough that Mason could feel it through Molly's dress. He placed his hand over hers, marveling at the life growing within her, a life that had survived poison, gunfire, and the worst that evil men could devise. "What should we name the baby?" Molly asked. Mason considered the question, thinking about the courage he'd witnessed that day, from his wife, from his friends, from Sheriff Cross in his moment of redemption. "If it's a boy, I'd like to call him Nathan, after the sheriff who found his courage when it mattered most. And if it's a girl—" Mason smiled, remembering the sight of his pregnant wife leaning out a shattered window with a rifle in her hands, defending their home with the ferocity of a mother protecting her young. "If it's a girl, we'll call her Victoria, because she'll be born into a world where good triumphed over evil, where justice prevailed over corruption, and where her parents learned that some victories are worth any sacrifice." 3 months later, on a crisp February morning in 1885, Victoria Keller made her entrance into the world. Healthy, strong, and blessed with her mother's green eyes and her father's determined spirit. Sheriff Nathaniel Cross stood as her godfather, having become one of the most respected lawmen in the territory after exposing and dismantling Vandermeer's corruption network. Cornelius Vandermeer himself was serving a life sentence in the territorial prison, his vast holdings divided among the families he'd tried to destroy. The Colorado Valley bloomed with prosperity as honest ranchers and farmers worked their land without fear of intimidation or violence. And in the rebuilt Keller Ranch house, Mason and Molly raised their daughter with the knowledge that courage, determination, and the willingness to stand up for what's right could overcome any evil the world might offer. Some stories end with victory, some end with justice. The best ones, like Mason and Molly's, end with hope. And so, in the fertile valleys of Colorado Territory, where water meant life and land meant everything, one family's courage sparked a revolution that freed an entire community from the grip of corruption and greed. Mason Keller proved that a man's worth isn't measured by the acres he owns, but by his willingness to defend what he loves. When he found his pregnant wife dying from poison in their own bed, he faced an impossible choice: surrender everything they'd built or fight against overwhelming odds with no guarantee of survival. Molly Keller showed us that a mother's love knows no limits and recognizes no obstacles. At 6 months pregnant, she could have hidden safely while others fought for her family's future. Instead, she stood at her bedroom window with her father's rifle and declared to the world that some things are worth more than safety, that home, family, and the promise of new life are worth any sacrifice. Sheriff Nathaniel Cross discovered that it's never too late for redemption. After years of compromise and corruption, he looked in the mirror and chose to become the man his badge demanded him to be. His courage to turn against his benefactor and expose 15 years of evidence proved that even the most corrupted soul can find its way back to justice. But perhaps the most powerful lesson of this story comes from the community that rallied around the Keller Ranch. 15 families put aside their own safety to stand with neighbors in need. They proved that when good people unite against evil, when honest folks refuse to be intimidated by money and violence, corruption cannot survive. Little Victoria Keller was born into a world cleansed by her parents' courage, a world where justice prevailed, where communities stood together, and where the next generation could grow up free from the fear that had plagued their parents. Mason and Molly's story reminds us that we all face moments when we must choose between what's easy and what's right, between looking the other way and standing up for justice, between protecting ourselves and protecting others who cannot protect themselves. What would you do if faced with Mason's impossible choice? Have you ever had to risk everything to defend what you believed in? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear about the moments when you chose courage over comfort. If this tale of frontier justice and unbreakable love moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more epic adventures from the American frontier. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story of courage, redemption, and the kind of love that conquers all obstacles. Your next journey into the untamed West is just one click away. Until then, remember, sometimes the greatest victories come not from what we're willing to gain, but from what we're willing to sacrifice for those we love. Thanks for riding along with Mason and Molly, and I'll see you on the next trail.